We are waiting for Dawie Roodt to come and fill us in about the speech, what the impact thereof is, and the implications.
Hello, Isaac. Good afternoon to you. I hope you can hear me.
And there Dawie is. He just joined us for this time. He has arrived, Dawie Roodt, to share his insights about the mini budget with us. Now, Dawie is a founder member, director, and chief economist of the Efficient Group. Lately, he's also the chairman of Efficient Private Clients, an affiliate of the Efficient Group. Dawie is also South Africa's most quoted economist with more than 30 years experience as an economist. He specializes in monetary and fiscal policy, and he's the anchor for the television program on Bait Sake for more than 17 years now. And all of this is just the tip of the iceberg, forming part of who Dawie Roodt really is. Welcome, Dawie. You are going to share your insights with us, and after that, we will have a little chat about it. But interesting times in South Africa after this speech. What is your opinion about it?
Thank you very much, Isaac, and thank you very much for hosting this specific event. I just want to hear from you. Can you hear me fine? Can you see me fine? Can you see the presentation fine?
I can see you fine. Let me see if the people that tuned in to us, it looks like they are happy. The questions are coming, and I think you can shoot straight away.
Okay, I just want to thank my team very, very much for the hard work that we've put in. I just want to give you a bit of a perspective. I showed you, we sent you a presentation that you've been running just now. It's just a preliminary sort of framework that we've prepared, and we've just completed everything, and that's the reason for being a few minutes late. I hope you will forgive me for that. But we've completed the presentation. It will be the first time that I will be seeing the full presentation myself. So I think I'm going to be a little bit surprised myself. So without any further ado, so let's go in. And before I into that, maybe I can just explain the budgetary process of the Minister of Finance. And what happens is that, remember, we first have the normal budget of the Minister of Finance in February, and that is the typical platform where certain adjustments in terms of policy are announced. And then typically we would have the medium-term budget policy statement in October, what we've just had. This is not a framework, it's not a platform from where adjustments or policy changes are made, but we've also had this year for the first time an emergency medium-term budget policy statement, and that was what happened in June. So this is completely different times in which we are living. Before I get to the budget itself, let me maybe just start off internationally in the international context. What is going on internationally, we all know there's a lot of political changes happening internationally. That is important for South Africa as a small open economy. Internationally, fiscal debt levels are at record high levels. Of course, for various reasons. It's not the first time this has happened. It's especially the past 10 years. But in the current the lockdown crisis, they had a huge impact on the fiscal debt levels of most countries in the world. Monetary policy internationally is totally unorthodox, which means that central banks are doing funny things. They cut interest rates to exceptionally low levels, below zero in some instances, and they're printing money out of nothing, giving it fancy names like quantitative easing as an example. And we currently have an environment where it's either risk on or risk off. And what I mean by that is that the developed economies is seen as a lower risk environment, and quite often when there's uncertainty, we find that, for example, the dollar will appreciate, and when there's a little bit more stability internationally, the rand typically will appreciate. So whatever happens internationally certainly affects the South African economy as well. Yeah, go on. Some local content or some local context that I think is important as well. We are currently experiencing not a recession, but a very deep depression. The South African economy has never gone through this kind of economic adjustment that we're currently going through. And I just want to make a very important point, that this is not because of the virus. Certainly this is a bad virus, and certainly people are dying because of the virus, but this is simply because of the lockdown. There's a big difference between the impact of the virus and the impact of the lockdown. The lockdown is the reason why the South African economy is going through all this, well, through this huge contraction that we are currently experiencing. Also keep in mind that even before the lockdown, we had a collapsing state, collapsing just about all over the place, the local authorities, provinces, national departments, the state-owned enterprises. We had a highly incompetent and a corrupt government. Things are hopefully changing a little bit, but up to now things were really horrible as far as the state is concerned in South Africa. Also a lot of political infighting in South Africa. It seems as if the president is winning a little bit, but the reality is there's a lot of uncertainty still. And then, of course, the ideological confusion. And the ideological confusion, I think there's a little bit less confusion after the speech today. And I think Tito Mboweni lost the ideological battle within the tripartite alliance. And then, of course, labor problems. We've got major labor issues in South Africa, especially organized labor. I'm referring specifically to COSATU. And we know COSATU very well organized, and we know COSATU can be quite destructive if they really want to be. And then we've got the recovery plan of the president, and the big question is, how is the president's recovery plan going to be funded? All right, so a few other things. I think it's also important for the context. Remember, there are 19 million people receiving grants in South Africa, 19 million of them. There are approximately 2 million civil servants in South Africa, perhaps even a little bit more. 1.2 million of them are work in the so-called national departments mostly, but remember there are local authorities and the state-owned enterprises as well. They're all civil servants, and there are only 14 million people actually employed in South Africa. So we have 21 million people that are directly depending on the state for a monthly income every month, and there are only 14 million people that are part of the productive sector in South Africa. Now, these are some of my estimates, some of my calculations, and this specific graph is per capita GDP in South Africa the last couple of years. It is important to note, and it's important to understand, that the South African economy was in a recession before the current crisis. The South African economy on a per capita basis, the average South African has been getting poorer in South Africa for the past 5 years. In this specific year, this year alone, per capita GDP is likely to collapse by about 15%. Now that graph illustrates it quite nicely. A huge contraction in per capita GDP that can be expected in the current financial year. Of course, it differs a little bit from economist to economist, but expect, and we all know there's a huge contraction in per capita GDP. Here are some of my first impressions of the medium-term budget of the Minister of Finance. It seems to me as if Treasury is not the center of the budget anymore. The President seems to be getting more and more involved in fiscal policy, and the center of fiscal policy seems to be moving to the union buildings, not to Treasury anymore, for various reasons. And I think there could be some ideological reasons as well. One is that we know Tito Mboweni, which I respect as a good Minister of Finance, but one reason is that he is probably seen as too right-wing, while the President and Pravin Gordhan and some of the other colleagues are seen as more progressive, and that they want to take control of this whole process. And despite Tito Mboweni kicking in the budgetary process has been taken over, it seems to me, by the likes of the President and Pravin Gordhan. So it seems to me the President from now on is actually the Minister of Finance, and Tito Mboweni is simply following the lead of his leader then. The Treasury, as we all know, has also been weakened in recent years, and that is perhaps part of the reason for the shift in emphasis, not where the Minister of Finance is taking control, but more of the President taking control. That means that I think, ideologically at least, Pravin Gordhan has won the fight, which means that Tito Mboweni has lost the fight, which means that we all have lost the fight. I'm referring to many examples, and I'm going to touch on some of those. But a very good example is South African Airways, where Tito Mboweni initially said he's not going to give any more money to South African Airways, and guess what? Pravin Gordhan won that specific fight. All right, come on. Then the economic plan, and I think this is part of the context, the economic plan of the President, and here are some of the highlights of the President's economic plan and some criticism that I have looking at the President's economic plan. First of all, it is infrastructural centered plan, which in itself is not necessarily a problem, but the reality is, if you look at infrastructural spending, the last couple of years by the state-owned enterprises, there was a complete or just about a complete collapse from capital investment from state-owned enterprises the last couple of years. Now, all of a sudden now, we're going to see a huge increase in capital spending by the state-owned enterprises as an example, or central government, and I really doubt whether we will be able to turn that around. The president is also planning to create 800,000 jobs, and that's before the end of March next year. So in the next couple of months, he's going to create 800,000 jobs. A very important point to make here is that he's not going to create 800,000 jobs. He's going to keep 800,000 people busy. And that's the difference between real jobs and keeping people busy. And unfortunately, many of these people that will be so-called employed will simply be paid, and they will be used in waving flags, as an example. Those are not real sustainable kind of jobs. That will require nearly 14 billion rand extra, which the Minister of Finance budgeted for in his medium-term budget. And of course, there was an extension of these grants for an additional 3 months, which will also cost us approximately 6 billion rand extra, which the Minister, of course, also budgeted for in his speech today. The plan of the President is also centered around more electricity generation, the digital spectrum, the rolling out of digital spectrum, and it's mostly about spending. Not much about the funding part, but a lot about spending. Now, this is important because we have a government that's very good on spending, but we don't have a government that's very good in implementation, and also certainly not a government that actually tells us where the money is going to come from. And I'm going to give you some examples of that during this presentation. All right, just one or two things about the budgetary process. Now, I don't think anybody can, in a current environment, really prepare a proper budget, because everything is so volatile that whatever the minister says can be taken with quite a significant pinch of salt, because things are changing so fast that nobody can really make proper estimates on what can be expected. And I've got some comparisons that I will share with you just now. The minister also mentioned a zero-based budget previously. This is not a zero-based budget. I've spoken to quite a number of departments, and I know that they were not really required to start from zero. So this cannot be called a zero-based budget. This certainly is not a zero-based budget. And then I'm afraid to say that the wastage at the state-owned enterprises, the Minister of Finance, his words are pretty much hollow from now on, because how can we believe the Minister of Finance if he says he's not going to spend money on South African Airways, as an example, and he keeps on doing that. Then a couple of comments about taxes. At the moment, tax morality in South Africa is probably at an all-time low. The minister is referring to things like, for example, tax elasticity, which simply means that they're going to become more efficient in collecting more taxes over the next couple of years. I did mention the efficiency of Treasury. That certainly is not what it used to be. I've got some doubts if they will be really successful in collecting more taxes. In other words, to improve the tax elasticity. Then, of course, the minister previously talked about the solidarity tax. I haven't seen anything about the solidarity tax in the specific speech of the minister today, but there are two possibilities, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. The possibility of the introduction of a wealth tax. Remember, this is not a policy forum of the minister. Policy will be set in February. So could there be a wealth tax? That certainly is a possibility. I don't think it will happen, because for practical purposes, if there's anything, my suspicion is that there will be an increase in personal income taxes, and another surprise, which I will get to a little bit later. Now, here's some estimates and some comparisons over time. First of all, look at GDP numbers. Now, the GDP numbers are the estimates of the Minister of Finance in February. He expected the economy to grow by 0.2%, and then in June he said the economy is going to contract by 7.2%, and then he said in October the economy is going to contract by, just now he just said the economy is going to contract by 7.8%. The point I'm trying to make, every time that there are official numbers released, every time those numbers are worse than previously. My estimates for economic growth in the current calendar year is for economic contraction of around about 11%. Those are my estimates, and in many instances, major institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, all of them, their estimates are deteriorating. Look, for example, in the fiscal deficit as well. The fiscal deficit is the difference between what they spend and what they get in. I'll show you some numbers just on that just now. Initially, the Minister of Finance in the budget in February expected a fiscal deficit of minus 6.8%, or that's the amount of money that they're going to borrow relative to the size of the economy. That deteriorated to about 14-15% in June, and it deteriorated once again to about 60% in the speech of the minister today. My estimates, and I've had this estimate for quite some time, is that the actual number is probably going to be around about 18% of GDP. The debt to GDP ratio, another very important matrix to look at when you talk about the fiscal accounts. Initially, the minister said it's going to be around about 65% to GDP at the end of the current financial year, which will end March next year. Then they changed that, of course, because of the lockdown, pushed that up to 82% to GDP. Now he kept that, and this is an interesting one. He kept that at 82% to GDP in today's speech, and my estimate is for about 84% to GDP. I've got a suspicion this is a typo. I've got a suspicion this is a typo in the minister's numbers of today, because how can I increase the deficit to GDP but not increase the debt to GDP? So it doesn't make sense. I think that's a typo. So the actual numbers, the minister's numbers should probably be about 83% or maybe 84%. And my number is 84% to GDP as well. Just one or two other numbers. We've already lost 2.5 million jobs in South Africa, and we've already closed down probably around about 100,000 businesses in South Africa because of the lockdown. Okay, this is state revenue as a percentage of GDP. The source of this is the South African Reserve Bank, and my estimates. The last one is my estimates for the current financial year. And as you can see, a complete and a total collapse in state revenue. It is happening across just about all the revenue items. So a huge contraction in state revenue in the current financial year. Minister of Finance reckons this is going to improve over the next couple of years. Of course, we will have to wait and see whether things will really improve. But so far, as you can see, things are really collapsing. This is just a graph of a composition of the various taxes. And they are, the most important one is personal income taxes. And you can see that is the biggest chunk there. The second one, second most important one is value-added tax. The value-added tax is just over a quarter of total tax collections, followed by company taxes, which is actually a relatively small, only 16% or so, and then a couple of other taxes, like for example the fuel levy and the like. So which one of those major taxes? You can increase a lot of other taxes. You can increase the sin taxes, which I expect is going to happen, but it's not going to collect, it's not going to bring in that much. There are only 2 or maybe 3 taxes that can bring in more money. That's personal income taxes, value-added tax, and company taxes. The other ones are really small fry, so expect some changes in some of those major taxes in the budget of the Minister of Finance next year. Now, can we, remember the minister changed his estimates on the tax revenue in the current financial year. He now expects us to collect approximately 310 billion less than originally budgeted for. So we've got a new target on state revenue in the current financial year. But if you look at the track record, and this is the track record for Treasury in terms of revenue the last couple of years, and every year they were below estimates. And this year, I'm afraid, they're probably going to be below estimates again. My estimates for revenue under collection is probably about 320, 330, maybe even more, less than the original budgeted estimates for the Minister of Finance. Okay, some expected tax changes. Like I said, the minister expects the revenue to be about 313 billion below the budgeted estimates. I think he's on a conservative side. I think it's probably going to be about 330 or maybe even more compared to the original budgeted estimates of February. And then there's a solidarity tax. Where is the solidarity tax going to come from? Is it from personal income taxes, or is it perhaps from a wealth tax? I don't think so. I don't think it will be from a wealth tax, but I have a suspicion that personal income taxes will be increased. Currently, the marginal rate of personal income taxes is about 45%. I won't be surprised if we see the minister increasing that to 50% in the budget of next year. It's not going to help much, simply because there are not enough rich people in South Africa. But certainly we're going to collect a little bit more on that. Now, those two numbers, personal income tax increase of 9% and value tax increase of 20%, those two numbers are numbers that I've picked up in some of the additional documentation that the Minister of Finance released today. So what the minister expects is that personal income taxes will increase by approximately 9% next year. Keep in mind, and of course there will be a bounce back. The bounce back will probably be around about 3% relative. And then you have inflation around about 3% or so. which leaves another 2% or so increase. So it seems to me the minister is already penciling in an increase in personal income taxes. But the interesting one for me, the really interesting one, is that huge increase in value-added tax. A 20%, this is nominal, so a 20% increase in value-added taxes. Now that seems to me as if the minister is even considering an increase in VAT. Now that is politically extremely difficult to do, but that's the only alternative. If we really want to increase more, get more money from taxes, that's the only real alternative, and that is to increase VAT. Then a couple of other things that I expect can be increased. He didn't mention that, but that I expect can be increased in the February budget next year. Capital gains tax could be increased, or some changes there. We could see an increase in estate duties and the like. Those are all wealth taxes, by the way. The fuel levy obviously will be increased. VAT, I mentioned that. And the interesting one is the sin taxes. Now, I've heard of people paying 200 Rand or 300 Rand for a packet of cigarettes during the lockdown. And the thinking is that if people are prepared to pay so much for cigarettes, then we can increase the taxes on that quite considerably as well. So expect an increase in sin taxes and quite a substantial increase in sin taxes. But the result, there will be some unintended consequences. And the most significant unintended consequences, all you're going to do, you're simply going to drive the alcohol and the tobacco industry underground, and that means you're simply going to support the illegal guys. They've really established themselves very, very well during the lockdown, and if you increase those taxes, they will be out there, they will be waiting for you, and they will be putting all those taxes into their pocket. So an increase in sin taxes is not necessarily going to lead to an increase in additional revenue. An increase in taxes and taxes will simply result in more people in driving the specific industry underground, the way it has been operating during the lockdown in any way. So then the only alternative to really, if you want to get the fiscal accounts on a healthy footing, must be on the spending side. We have to cut spending somehow, and that essentially means this is where we're going to cut. We have to cut spending on people. That means spend less on the wage bill and on grants, by the way. And if we spend less on people, people get angry. The second possibility is that we have to spend less on the state-owned enterprises, which of course they're not doing. They are promising us everything, but they're not doing that. And if you spend less on the state-owned enterprises, it also means that you're going to spend less on people. Now, Eskom is an excellent example. There are probably about 20,000 too many people being paid by Eskom. So if you cut back on the wage bill at Eskom, a lot of people will get angry at you. So the spending conundrum at the moment is simply that if you want to stabilize the fiscal accounts, you must spend less money on people. And that is really the real political problem is here. Apart from people getting angry, is that your political allies, COSATU specifically, is certainly not going to like that. Additionally, we're so far down the path already. So we're so far down the collapse in the fiscal accounts today is that we just do not have choices anymore. So if we cut spending the way that we're supposed to be cut spending, and we don't see much cut in spending here, despite what the Minister of Finance is saying, there's not really much cut in spending. But if we do cut spending, we're actually going to force this economy into a deeper recession. But that's the only alternative of getting out of this hole, because we do not have other choices anymore. This is just the spending numbers relative to GDP. My estimates, the red one over there, and the spending is likely to just keep on going up like there's no tomorrow. And we can quite clearly see that we've seen an increase in spending the last couple of years. So, and another increase in spending can be expected. The Minister said he's going to turn around soon, but soon is just not coming soon enough, it seems. And then on the wage bill, 40% of total state spending goes on wages. The Minister has been mentioned, and previously already, he said he's going to cut about the 160 billion off the wage bill. There's no cut. There's certainly no cut in wages. All that's going to happen is that he's not going to spend the money that they thought he's going to spend previously. So there's no cut. It's just not such a big increase anymore. So we have to understand that. Of course, there is currently a court case where COSATU and government is involved in a bit of a fight in court on whether the last wage agreement will be implemented or not. So the Minister of Finance is simply assuming he's going to win the specific court case. The jury is out on that one, quite literally. So we don't know. And then, but the Minister of Finance did promise a reduction in the wage bill, and he also mentioned some wage freeze in some of the wages. Interesting, and I would like to see he's going to do that. The minister proposed, and he mentioned, a possible pay cut for senior civil servants. Something else on the wage bill, I've just made a quick calculation. The average civil servant in South Africa, the salary of the average civil servant in South Africa is in fact more than 400,000 Rand per year already. And I've done many calculations on this. If you compare the civil servants to the private sector, the civil servants are significantly better remunerated than the private sector equivalents. Not only that, I mentioned we've lost 2.5 million jobs so far this year. All those jobs, each and every one of them, were jobs lost in the private sector, and not a single one of those jobs were jobs lost in the civil service. So it's the private sector carrying this game. All right, the bags ball, okay, Furinti. Thanks. All right, then the minister is talking about the crocodile. Now, I know many political analysts are talking about the fiscal accounts, or many economists are talking about the fiscal accounts and saying that this is, if the Minister of Finance cuts back on state spending, that it is an austere, or it's talking about austerity. This is an austere budget, which simply means it's a budget that is weighing on economic growth or holding back on economic growth. Economists will call this a contractionary budget. That is certainly not the case. We haven't had an austere budget for a very, very long time. The mere fact that we have such a huge deficit is proof that we have an expansionary budget. In fact, if you look at the debt to GDP ratios, I will show you that just now, you will see that debt just keeps on going up. That is no austerity. This is a hugely expansionary budget, and it remains a hugely expansionary budget. Another good example is the fiscal deficit. Well, it will be around about 800 billion Rand in the current financial year. 800 billion Rand. That's the amount of money that the Minister of Finance needs to borrow on a net basis in the current financial year. Of that 800 billion Rand, 500 billion Rand of that will be spent on current expenditure. Current expenditure is like, for example, salaries. And that debt that is incurring there, our children will still have to pay off that debt that we pay on salaries on civil servants today. It's like using your mortgage to buy groceries. So the saving of the state in the current financial year is approximately 500 billion Rand. Or put differently, the state is a destroyer to the tune of approximately 500 billion Rand in the current financial year. Another point that is important, the fiscal deficit, like I've mentioned, is roughly about 17% of GDP. Our total savings in South Africa is between 15 and 20% of GDP, which simply means that the fiscal deficit, that required borrowing of the state in the current financial year, will take up all the existing savings that are available in the economy, leaving nothing to the private sector to invest, which simply means in making South Africa exceptionally vulnerable and dependent on foreign capital inflows. And that, of course, will be affected by the rating agencies. So this is the original jaws of the Minister of Finance. He presented this jaws to us in June, in his June emergency budget. On the left-hand side, that is on the top line is state expenditure, state spending. On the bottom line is state revenue. And you can see how those jaws of the crocodiles are opening up. And on the right-hand side, we have the fiscal debt trajectory. And the Minister of Finance told us that if we do nothing, the debt trajectory will follow the top line. If we do something, the debt trajectory will follow the bottom line. It will stabilize at 87% of GDP, and then from then on it will start coming down. So this is what he promised to us in June, not long ago. This is the promise of the Minister of Finance in June. Things has changed today. Now here's the new, on the left-hand side, the new crocodile. Now this is what the Minister of Finance is promising us. He's promising us that state spending will go up very sharply, but then it will come down very sharply. While on the revenue side, taxes, it collapsed, but suddenly there will be better collections, and of course tax increases, more efficiency in SARS, and that jaws of the crocodile will be closing down. Whether he's going to be successful in that, I'm not so sure. On state spending, the single fastest growing item on the budget of the Minister of Finance is interest on state debt. We can quite clearly see that, and interest is eating up a bigger part of total state spending every day, quite literally. And this is the most recent numbers today of the Minister of Finance, and we can see the increases in state spending is happening on interest on state debt, followed by some other variables. But debt, that is the sign of whether an economy is heading for a fiscal debt trap, and that rate of increase in debt and interest on state debt certainly points to a serious deterioration in the fiscal accounts. This is my estimates on the fiscal deficit. Now, we've had a fiscal deficit for many years. Now, looking at this scale, it's very difficult really to see, to appreciate what's been happening on the fiscal accounts, because we were, quite like I've mentioned earlier, already in deep trouble looking at the fiscal accounts previously. Now, this is what's going to happen to the fiscal accounts in the current financial year: a complete collapse in the revenue and a huge increase in spending, leading then to the fiscal deficit as a percentage of GDP collapsing to approximately 17 to 18% of GDP. A few comments about saving. I did mention this already, and that the total savings in the economy is totally consumed mostly by the fiscal deficit, which means there's very, very little left for the private sector to actually invest, making us extremely vulnerable to capital flows, making us dependent on capital flows. Now, the funding so far, a couple of points, a few things that you need about funding. Remember, this huge fiscal deficit needs to be funded, and we're funding it in quite a number of unusual ways. We know, for instance, that there's a World Bank funding that is still pending, a $2 billion funding, that the World Bank is still negotiating that specific funding. The World Bank seems to be a bit reluctant to lend us this money. They're too concerned that the money is going to go to wage increases, or too much on wages, or rather put differently, that wages will not be reduced significantly, or too much money will be going to state-owned enterprises, which indeed is happening. R1 billion came from the New Development Bank, which is the BRICS Bank. We've got that billion, or rather $1 billion. We've got that $1 billion already in. We all know about the 4.3 billion that came from the International Monetary Fund. That's a rapid financing instrument. So that's something that's pretty much automatic. The next tranche, if you go back to the IMF again, there will be quite a lot of more requirements before the IMF gives us money again. It's not going to be so easy the next time around. 5 billion rand was borrowed from the African Development Bank. 50 million rand was borrowed from the World Bank, and there's probably going to be more from the IMF. And just something interesting, the result or the reaction on the financial markets during the speech of the minister today was for the rand weakening, but also for long bonds going up. Now, this is important, because an economist look at this all the time. Bond yields or interest rates on the capital market is a very good indication on whether the markets actually expect the Minister of Finance to achieve his longer term targets. And looking at the reaction of the financial markets, the markets simply don't trust the Minister of achieving these targets. Now, one thing that concerns me is that long-term yields are approximately 5% or 500 basis points higher than short-term yields. Now, the reason why that is happening is that people say, listen, I'm prepared to lend the state. We'll be prepared to lend the South African government money in the short term, but not in the medium longer term, because we don't believe they will repay our debt in the medium longer term as easy as in the short term. So that is, and it could also be because investors are concerned about longer term inflation. Reality is, however, we're happy to give you money in the short term, but in the longer term, if we want to take our money, you have to pay more. Long-term yields keep on going up. Okay. And then the Minister of Finance did mention today that another $1 billion is they're currently negotiating with the BRICS Bank for an additional $1 billion. That was the announcement by the Minister today. My apologies. Is this a debt trap in which we found ourselves? Well, first of all, South Africa's debt levels are the highest it's ever been. The highest it's had been previously was around about 50% of GDP. When Tito, when he took over as the minister, rather Trevor Manuel took over as the Minister of Finance, and that's the highest it's been. Since then, it took Trevor Manuel about 14 years to bring it down. to about 25% of GDP, and then Pravin Gordhan took over as the Minister of Finance. So we've never seen these sort of debt levels. The debt levels, the end of the current financial year, about 85% of GDP, will be 35% more than the highest debt levels that we had in the late 1990s of about 50% of GDP. But remember also, in the 1990s, the state-owned enterprises were significantly better managed, and the total outstanding debt of the state-owned enterprises was significantly less than what it is today. Today, the state-owned enterprises, their debt as a percentage of GDP exceeds 10% of GDP. Only Eskom has got 500 billion debt on its own balance sheet. That's debt that the state needs to stand in for. So actually what you have to do, you have to look at the current 85% of GDP debt, plus another more than 10% if you want to include all the guarantees of the state-owned enterprises. So already in the current financial year, we have debt to GDP ratio of about 80 to 95% of GDP. It's nearly double when it was its previous highest, when Trevor Manuel took over as the Minister of Finance. And of course, we see a rising interest. Rising interest is something that is consuming more money, which means less money is available for other expense items. That means that eventually people will stop lending money to the state. And I'm afraid, and I will come back to that a little bit later, that may eventually lead to prescribed assets to pension funds if we can't get this fiscal boat, if we can't fix it very soon. And currently the debt servicing cost is nearly 5% of GDP, or put differently, 5% of the economy, equal to 5% of the economy, is used to pay interest on state debt only. This is our debt to GDP trajectory that I've calculated. It's likely, like I've said, it's likely to go up to about 100%. And my estimates soon, pretty soon, we're probably going to see in 2024 debt to GDP ratio actually getting to about 100% to GDP, although the Minister of Finance reckons he will be able to stabilize it at lower levels. This is the Minister of Finance's most recent estimates. He reckons he will be able. Now, let me just give the context here. Remember, in June, the Minister of Finance said he's going to stabilize debt to GDP ratio at 87% of GDP, come hell or high water. Well, he just reneged on that. So what's going to happen now is new estimates. He's going to allow debt to GDP to go up to 95% of GDP. And, well, the question is, will he be successful? I really doubt that. How to avert the debt crisis? Well, we can increase taxes. And certainly they're going to try to do that. I'm just afraid that an increase in taxes, even if you want to do that, and even if you are successful, is not going to yield that much money. So that is just not an option that is available anymore. We have to cut spending, and that inevitably means that we have to cut spending on people. If we cut spending on people, then people get very angry, like I've mentioned. Or we can grow the economy. Now, the President announced a new growth strategy, and I'm afraid I am not too optimistic about this growth strategy of the President, whether that is going to lead to these strong economic growth rates that the President expects. Certainly not a 3% growth. By the way, next year we can quite easily see a 3% growth. And so I agree with the Minister of Finance, but it is, like the Minister said, is because of the very low base in the current financial year that we could see relatively high growth. So the Minister wants to plan to stabilize state debt now at 95% of GDP, and at a later date, a year later than what he previously promised us, at the year 25, 26. And also keep in mind that there are some other liabilities that are not included in the debt of the state, and a certain contingent liabilities, like, for example, a 200 billion credit guarantee scheme at the banks, which is also not included. It can become part of state debt, it's not, but something that we all need to be very, very concerned about is a road accident fund. And the deficit of the road accident fund is likely to be close to 600 billion rand in 22-23, which is actually more even than what Eskom currently owes. So if you really talk about debt, then we are in very, very deep trouble talking about debt. And then I call them the parasitals. The state-owned enterprises, a couple of comments. Not all of this is not necessarily new, just a summary of things. Like the NEL is probably, they're asking for 2.6 billion more this year. I haven't picked that up yet, but they're asking for this. I don't know when they're going to get that. We know South African Airways, I The Minister of Finance promised us he's not going to do this, and he did that. So he lost the fight. Pravin Gordhan won the fight. So 10.5 billion, which is going to go to South African Airways. He put the emphasis on it that this is to fund the business rescue plan. Does that mean they're going to close it down? Because if they don't close it down, 10.5 is not enough. They need 20 billion if they really want to let this thing fly again. 20 billion, because subsequently, from the 10 billion to 10 million estimates were done, the environment changed quite a lot. And in order for South African Airways to be successful commercially, 10 billion is just not enough. PRASA, they are in trouble. There was nothing for PRASA that I've picked up yet. Post Office, they are in trouble. SABC, they got 1.1 billion in February, but they want more. So maybe in the budget next year, who knows? The SABC, another one that should be closed down. Transnet is an interesting one. Transnet is not there with a begging bowl. They're not asking for money. In fact, they made a small profit. But that's smoke and mirrors, to be honest, because the capital infrastructure of Transnet is deteriorating to such an extent that that you have to account for that in your financial statements. And if you do that, then Transnet actually made a loss of nearly 20 billion rand, by the way. So although officially they're profitable, but if you account for the capital destruction at Transnet they are running, there's probably a loss of about 20 billion. The airports company, they also mentioned they want more money, and Sunroll is probably going to get some money as well. And we know Sunroll and this issue about the toll roads and so on. And that is also one of those issues that are not resolved yet, typically, of government. There are some other issues that are also not resolved by government. I'll get to that just now. The South African Land Bank, the Land Bank received 3 billion rand in the February budget. But what is interesting is that the Land Bank's lending contracted by about 30%. So they're lending about 30% less than originally, which is quite important. They have about 6 billion loans that's still guaranteed by the state. They want an additional 10 billion, which we're probably going to see in February, because the Land Bank is quite important because of food security in South Africa. But what is happening is that they're losing their best customers, the Land Bank. They're losing their best customers to the banks typically, and of course that means that when you had a bit of a cross subsidization previously at the Land Bank, that will not happen in future anymore because they're good customers. They're losing those, and that means that the Land Bank will probably remain under some pressure financially for the foreseeable future. So, but in the meantime, we can't let Land Bank go under because we need Land Bank to fund the farmers in order to produce food in South Africa. What a disaster. The next one, but the big one, Eskom. This is one of the biggest threats to the South African economy. It's financially and operationally severely damaged, we know that. There was no mention about the debt. Now, this is a can that they just keep on kicking down the road. And this has been going on for years. Eskom needs about 250 billion rand just to stay afloat financially. And nobody wants to answer this question. So where is this money going to come from? And again, we didn't get an answer from Minister of Finance today. Will PIC debt eventually be converted into so-called equity? Where is this 250 billion going to come from? Will the President's energy plans work? Many questions, not many answers. A couple of other announcements. The Minister did mention, I'm not against this, but there's a thing in this style. He did mention a change to Section 28 of the Pension Fund Act, allowing pension funds to invest more in infrastructure, which in principle is nothing wrong with. But that's a tiny small step from a prescribed asset. So they've been very vocal about that, no prescribed assets, but watch out, because we ran out of money. Amendment of the Pension Funds Act to allow for pre-retirement withdrawals, which I also think is a good idea, especially with many people losing their jobs now. How can you expect people to wait for 65 when they're dying of hunger today? So I think that's a good idea as well. In fact, what I would suggest is a complete abolishment of the government employment pension fund and to outsource that completely to the private sector. Let's take the next step, in fact. And then the Minister of Finance did make a comment. I couldn't pick it up in the text so far. There's a lot of work to go through everything. But he did make a comment about foreign exchange regulations. That means he's going to put a stop to money, people wanting to take the money out of the country. So now nothing that I could pick up, but that really bothered, that really concerned me about what the Minister of Finance said. All this, of course, is not mostly bad news. The financial markets reacted quite negatively, but I just want to caution on something. Remember, South African bond yields currently around about 10%, and it's going up. It's very, very juicy. It's very, very attractive. And additionally, we have a very weak currency, and we have very liquid financial markets. So what we have essentially a cheap entrance for foreigners into South Africa, into a very liquid financial market, and with very attractive yields. So I will not be surprised if we suddenly see some improvement in the exchange rate of the currency and a sudden fall in the bond yields on the capital market, but that's only temporary because that is probably speculators coming in to take a bite out of the apple and they're simply going to run away again. So sustainably, that will simply not be sustained. But in the short term, sudden improvement in bond yields and the exchange rate of the currency certainly is possible. But for the medium longer term, there's only one direction for the currency, and that's for a weaker currency. The currency, like I've mentioned, is quite a weak currency. It can appreciate in the short term, but the rand is typically a barometer of international so-called risk on, risk off. Medium longer term, only one direction for a currency, and that is for a weaker currency. I've got a better economic plan. Now we've got a president spending money on infrastructure, the president wanting to spend money on many things. There's a long list of things that the president is going to spend money on. I've got a slightly different take on this. Remember, the president is basically the chief civil servant. I don't think what we need is more money to be spent on all sort of structures and all sort of items and projects and plans. I think what we need to do, we have to start where it really matters. Now we're going to spend money on people to clean the parks, people to clean the roads, and that money will be spent by the local authorities as an example. But the local authorities are completely dysfunctional, or most of them, the majority of them. The same goes if you compare the state-owned enterprises. We all know about the state-owned enterprises. The same goes to the national departments. It's a disaster. Education is a disaster. South Africa's education standards are of the lowest in the world. Now, here's my suggestion for an economic recovery plan. And that plan should be to put certain, to get the state to work properly. Just start where it really matters. So from now on, we've got a number of local authorities as an example with qualified audits. Get a special investigation unit going and make sure that all those local authorities are properly run and there's no corruption, and improve the efficiency of that. And that in itself will support the economy. Not only that, fix education. Make sure that our education standards is at least on average with the rest of the world. Look at the state-owned enterprises. Fix that. Just make sure it works properly. Doesn't mean more money. It simply means more efficiency. It simply means better management. And here's a simple solution. Maybe instead of all these fancy plans that we have, why don't we pick something easy? Why don't we pick an easy one? There are many plans of bullet trains and cities in the sky, but why don't we pick something easy, something that we know we can win with? Because the state, there are not many wins if you look at the state the last couple of years. And here's an easy one. What about something simple? Road safety. Get the Minister of Transport and say, listen, so many people are dying on our roads. We will not tolerate anybody breaking the traffic rules anymore. Just do that. Just get something right. And that in itself is likely to support the economy. So don't get involved in things that we're not supposed to be involved. Just do the stuff that you're supposed to be doing and just do that better. I've got a slide here on the good and the not so good ministers of finance. I think the best minister of finance, he was lucky, I must add, was Trevor Manuel. He took over, state debt was at 50% of GDP, half that. Pravin Gordhan took over and he doubled that again to more than 50% of GDP. Pravin Gordhan was probably the worst minister of finance we've ever had. He was the guy increasing state spending. It's not only his fault. He had Zuma, he had the financial crisis, but he was in charge. So Pravin Gordhan was a disaster as the Minister of Finance, and now he's the Minister of State and Enterprises, and the disaster continues. He simply refuses to let go of South African Airways. It's his fault. We had a couple of in-betweens, we know about those, and now Tito, the best that the ANC can offer without a doubt, but he's been handed a very, very difficult can to carry. And I'm afraid, I think Tito Mboweni is being set up to fail. And I'm not so sure Tito Mboweni is going to be around as the Minister of Finance for a long time, which is really a pity. Some advice to people, what I advise people to do, know what is going on. So make sure you find out what's going on with economic statistics, news and politics and stuff like that. Identify your risks. Make sure you know what your risk in your specific industry is. And make sure you can manage those risks. Those are the simple, high-level advice that I give to people. And what has happened in South Africa, we've run out of taxpayers now. We've basically run out of capital. Eskom is a good example. We've destroyed that. The next step will be to eye the savings of the savers, and eventually it means prescribed assets. And then what you will do, people are going to run away, and then you close the doors. It's called foreign exchange regulations, forex controls, which the minister mentioned the word today. And then there's only one thing left, and that is inflation. And we can already, in fact, see that the yield curve is perhaps telling us that the market is expecting inflation going forward. So that is a few comments on the medium-term speech of the Minister of Finance today. Any questions, you're welcome to send me. There's my email address. I think there are quite a number of people. I don't know how you want to handle this. Isak, you're welcome to ask questions if you want to. But there's my email address. Anybody interested in sending me an email for questions or investment advice, I will be happy to attend to that. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening to me. I'm not trying to be negative. I think there are a couple of things working very well in South Africa. One is the South African Reserve Bank. Lesotho Manyako is doing an absolutely brilliant job, but I have no doubt that the pressure on the South African Reserve Bank will simply build up over the next couple of years, because the outcome of these sort of parties are always the same, and that's high inflation. And that's the reason why the ANC wants to nationalize the Reserve Bank. Thank you very much for listening to me. Over to you, Isak. Thank you very much. Isak.
Thank you very much, Dawie. You sounded just like Minister Tito Mboweni just now when you said you don't try to be negative. When he said no, it's for the business rescue purposes that we're giving the allocation to SAA, because the question is, and one of the people that is watching this discussion at the moment also asked it. You use words like extremely, like totally, like very negative words to describe what is happening, and you sit here with such a heavy heart at what is waiting for us, because I mean it's clear as daylight. Is there no good news about the economy for us, and what are we going to do?
Yeah, the good news, there certainly is good news. There certainly is good news in South Africa. I did mention the Reserve Bank. That certainly is good news. There are many opportunities still to make money in South Africa, and a lot of people are still making money in South Africa. And I certainly advise people to make sure that a substantial portion of your investment is invested abroad. So those are the sort of things that you're supposed to be doing. But maybe, Isak, maybe I can quote Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill once said about the Americans, and he said, you know, you can always expect the Americans to do the right thing after they have exhausted all the alternatives. And that is the good news, because we've had a government that simply spent and spent and spent like there is no tomorrow. And now they've painted themselves into such a corner that there simply is no more room for more spending. So inevitably what will happen now is that they will spend less, not because they want to, but because literally the money is finished. And I guess in a weird kind of way, that is good news.
Dawie, and then just another question. We have seen what you or hear what you are saying about this mini budget, but just in summary, a broad description, as if you were walking out of Parliament just now and a journalist is standing in front of you and asking you, Dawie, Mr. Roodt, what is your view on the budget?
Well, my view is more a political view on the budget, and that is, my short answer to that is that Tito Mboweni, despite all the respect that I have for him, Tito Mboweni slipped today. Tito Mboweni lost the fight, but Pravin Gordhan and the other socialists won the fight. And I think that's the message that I got today. Despite all the tough talk, despite all these the estimates that the Minister of Finance put on the table and promising us he's going to achieve that. You have to believe me. He slipped today. Tito Mboweni slipped as the Minister of Finance. And I'm very disappointed. Well, I can't really say I'm disappointed in him because I think there was tremendous pressure on the Minister of Finance. But that's what the message I got from today. Tito Mboweni, he lost the fight. Pravin Gordhan won the fight today.
Dawie, then also, we knew it, you said it, Mboweni's speech was always going to be in the shadow of the President's Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan presented to a joint sitting of Parliament on 15 October. And it was also underscored by the fact that Treasury's power has been shifted to the Presidency, and we saw it today in action. But what are the practical implications for us as South Africans, the normal man in the street? What does that hold in for us?
You're talking about the president's plan specifically.
The fact that had of the shift to the presidency, and as you have said that Tito have lost. What does that mean for us as South Africans? Yeah,
what it means. Remember, within government, and that's one of the questions that we need to answer in South Africa, is that who is really in charge in government? Now, there are many different power centers in government. There's a power centers, obviously the president, obviously the Secretary General of the ANC, A.S. Magashule, obviously the deputy president, and in a way Tito Mboweni. Those are various power centers within government. And we don't really know who's in charge or really in charge of government, because quite often you will find the one power center says something and the other power center says something else. The nationalization of the Reserve Bank is an excellent example. What has happened recently is the president is consolidating his power without a doubt, but the president and Pravin Gordhan is pretty much in the same boat, and they are, let's call them left-leaning. A fancy word is progressive, which also means more state interventionist. So what we're going to see in future, and this lockdown actually taught them a very important lesson. The lesson that the politicians learned during this lockdown is that if you impose all sort of ridiculous rules on a population, they will follow your lead. They will actually do all these silly things that you expect them to do. Now the president, a left-leaning president, a more interventionist president, a more powerful president, means also a president that will try to do more. And that's a danger. We don't need a government that's doing more. We need a government that's doing better, and a government that's actually doing less. So for the man in the street, what we're going to see in future is more state interference, more taxes, and more disasters caused by the state. Don't think for one single moment that the local authorities will be better run in a year's time, or the state-owned enterprises will be better run. So this is it's a political shift, but with that came an ideological shift as well.
Dawie, and then there's another important question that I also picked up while listening to Minister Tito Mboweni. Implementation was the key word in the analysis of the President's Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan, with the emphasis on it being actually absent in Ramaphosa's speech. And in today's speech, we also heard it. It's nice words and ideas, but hollow plans, the critics say. Do you think that Mboweni managed to answer this question somehow or the other?
Yeah, certainly, without a doubt, the minister knows this. It's implementation. And again, in a weird kind of way, that is, maybe that's part of our saving grace in South Africa, is that a government that is pretty much incompetent, because that's what we have, is also not good in implementing a bad plan. But yes, I guess, and the minister also mentioned that a couple of times, it doesn't really make sense to have all these plans if the implementation doesn't really happen. And there are so many examples of implementation. Look at the mining industry. Are we waiting for all the necessary licenses and the like? Look at, for example, electricity. The president is promising us we're going to have a new electricity in a year's time. I doubt that, because implementation is just not happening. So yeah, but Tito Mboweni knows this, And he's trying to, and I think from his side, he's trying to put pressure. But listening to the reaction of the parliamentarians today, whenever he says something about how good the ANC is, they all clap hands and so on. That's untrue. The ANC is not good. The ANC is a bad government. And they're a bad government because they don't implement good plans and they don't manage the government well. And I'm afraid Tito Mboweni knows that. So, yes, implementation is the answer. Are we going to have implementation now? I'm not holding my breath.
Dawie, I still have 2 or 3 questions for you, if you will bear with me. The one is Razia Khan, the chief economist, Africa and Middle East, Standard Chartered Bank, said for the economic plan to work, the private sector will have to be on board because it's difficult to see what other sources of financing there could be. But for the private sector, given South Africa's weak trajectory of economic growth to date and the absence of meaningful reform prior to this, the question may well be, why commit? And my question is, do we have any clarity on that after today?
I can promise you, no, not after today, no, certainly not. But I can promise you the private sector is ready. The private sector is ready to invest in this country. The private sector is more than R1 trillion lying on the balance sheets of big companies in South Africa. They can literally invest R1 trillion overnight in South Africa. Not only the South African private sector, the international investors are very keen to invest where they can get the proper yield. But that's the question. Are you going to get the proper yield? And that's a function of economic growth. And I don't think you're going to get good yield. In fact, the financial markets are telling us exactly the opposite. And the second thing that you have to have trust in this government. And looking again at the financial markets, there simply isn't trust. And a very good example is the exchange rate of the currency. The rand is one of the weakest currencies in the world. So yes, the only place where we have money left is the private sector. And if you want to make a success of the South African economy, you have to convince the private sector that you are effective and efficient. And this time we're actually going to implement our plans and it is going to work well. Because the private sector has been bitten many times before. And I'm afraid the private sector is so shy now because of having been bitten previously. That's the only place where the money is. So if you want to get this economy growing, you have to get the private sector to participate. And the private sector will only participate if they can make money and if they trust you. Looking at the reaction on the financial markets today, that's not there.
Second last question, Dawie. Let's put us, the country, in the global arena. And the International Monetary Fund sees an uneven recovery ahead and a widening gap between countries. And private sector economists also concur, with many expecting what they call a K-shaped recovery that will take years before most countries get back to pre-pandemic levels. And even then, there are likely to be permanent scars. Now, taking into account that South Africa's public finances are unsustainable, as you have shown to us, with the latest update showing a debt peak of 87.4% of the GDP, this is levels that you have said we cannot sustain. With this in mind, can Mboweni's speech take us to safer ground? Where does this put South Africa when we are so far behind the other countries in terms of economical safety, if you want to call it that?
Yeah, the reality is that the world economy is probably going to contract about 4 or 5% this year. The reality also is that some emerging economies, many of them in Africa, unfortunately, are very, very highly indebted. We've just heard that Zambia, for example, just defaulted on its debt. Fortunately for us in South Africa, and that's another silver lining perhaps, is that a relatively small amount of state debt is actually foreign currency denominated. So that's a good thing. So I don't think we're going to get into a debt default situation soon. But if you ask me how long it's going to take before we're back to where we were previously, then like I've showed you, I mean, we already lost 5 years in per capita GDP. This year is going to be a massive loss. And I'm afraid if we do the right things, we can, with a bit of luck, we can get back in 10 years' time, which I think it's going to be difficult to do in any event. Okay, it seems to me is off. Okay, it seems to me, I don't know if the viewers are still there. Are they still online? So it seems to me as if I think we've reached the end of the session because of limitations that's put on there's some limitations, it seems to me. I've given you my email address. You're more than welcome to send me an email. I just want to thank Isak again and my team for assisting me. Thank you very much. I hope this worked well. And please don't see me as a negative economist. I really want this economy to grow and to start doing much, much better. And we have to start where it really matters, and that is with education, especially primary education. We are failing our children. And we as South Africans simply cannot allow people from going to bed hungry, and that is what's happening today. Why then can we spend money on South African Airways while people are going to bed hungry? That is just wrong. Thank you very much for listening to me.